In the ashes of a world consumed by war, fragments of truth were buried beneath rubble, sealed in vaults, and drowned in silence. They were not destroyed, only hidden, guarded like poison too dangerous to touch. Tonight, we unearth the shadows of forgotten archives, where erased names and vanished files whisper of betrayal, secret bargains, and experiments that should never have been born. What survived was not peace, but a legacy of secrets the victors could never allow to surface. In the closing months of the Second World War, as Allied bombers turned Germany's cities into rubble and the Wehrmacht crumbled on both fronts, a different kind of war was being waged far beneath the earth, deep under the Harz Mountains of central Germany, a labyrinth of reinforced concrete tunnels stretched for miles. Built with slave labor from Mittelbau-Dora, these subterranean facilities were the crown jewel of Germany's desperate gamble to produce superweapons capable of reversing its inevitable defeat. Among the most secret of these projects was something known only in fragmentary documents as Projekt Morgenrot, Project Dawn. Unlike the V2 rocket program or the jet fighter initiative, Morgenrot was not spoken of in Allied intelligence reports at the time. In fact, for decades, it was entirely absent from the known record. No surviving Wehrmacht officers ever testified to its existence in post-war trials, and not a single line appears in captured SS correspondence. Yet, in 1999, a set of declassified CIA aerial reconnaissance photographs taken in April 1945 surfaced in the National Archives, labeled "Restricted, Do Not Distribute." They showed massive earthworks in the Harz region that had not corresponded to any known facility, obliterated entrances, and strange geometric ground scars suggesting demolition charges had been detonated from within. What was destroyed in those tunnels has been the subject of speculation ever since. A few surviving engineers from Mittelwerk, interviewed in the late 1950s, spoke cautiously of a project that bypassed even Himmler's SSWVHA, the Wirtschafts- und Verwaltungshauptamt, responsible for concentration camp industries. They claimed the oversight came directly from the Reich Ministry for Armaments, under Albert Speer's technical branch, and reported directly to a small commission chaired by Luftwaffe General Erhard Milch. The workers themselves were never told what they were building. Unlike the assembly of rocket fuselages or jet engines, the components moved into the Morgenrot tunnels were odd, irregular metallic structures, some hexagonal, some tubular, delivered under armored guard. One engineer recalled seeing crates stamped with AEG and Siemens, yet their contents were unlike any known electrical apparatus of the time. Rumors began to circulate among US intelligence officers after the war. In a 1947 CIC Counter-Intelligence Corps memorandum, a line reads, "Multiple sources suggest German experimentation with high-energy discharge systems for undisclosed application. Possible overlap with projects recovered in Austria." The phrase high-energy discharge systems would later be interpreted as a crude description of what modern physicists might call directed energy or plasma-based weapons. But no schematics were ever recovered, at least none that have been made public. The Soviets, however, were less circumspect. In 1962, a defector from East Germany provided MI6 with reports claiming Soviet survey teams had penetrated partially collapsed tunnels near Nordhausen in 1946. According to his testimony, they retrieved both metallic debris and thousands of documents written in dense technical German. These were shipped directly to Moscow and classified under the heading Kwantowoje Orужие, quantum weapons. Western analysts at the time dismissed the claims as exaggeration, yet the story persisted. By the late Cold War, NATO analysts quietly admitted that some unexplained advances in Soviet plasma propulsion research might trace back to documents seized from those ruins. Local civilians in the Harz region have their own accounts. Several recalled hearing a massive subterranean detonation in late April 1945, days before American troops occupied the area. The blast was so powerful that windows shattered in villages miles away, though official records cite only standard demolitions as the cause. When US forces finally moved in, they found collapsed shafts sealed with reinforced concrete and scattered corpses of slave laborers who had been shot execution style at the tunnel entrances. The SS had left nothing to chance. Witnesses and evidence alike were systematically erased. What little remains of Morgenrot's documentation comes from scattered fragments in Allied and Soviet archives. A 12-page report from the US Army's Technical Intelligence Division, dated June 1945, mentions unrecovered apparatus possibly linked to advanced power transmission systems. A British file, long classified under the Public Records Act, and released only in 2009, describes test chambers lined with copper sheeting, discovered in one of the partially accessible tunnels. The report stops abruptly, concluding only that further examination was deemed hazardous due to unexplained radiation readings. No follow-up file has ever surfaced. By the 1970s, conspiracy writers had already woven Morgenrot into the larger mythology of Nazi wonder weapons, but serious historians remained skeptical. Yet the CIA's aerial photographs, clearly showing something vast and deliberately destroyed, continue to raise troubling questions. Why, in the most desperate weeks of the war, would German engineers expend enormous effort to demolish their own unfinished project instead of simply abandoning it? And if the project was truly worthless, why did both the US and Soviet intelligence agencies classify every reference to it for over half a century? Some believe the answer lies in a single Soviet report smuggled out of Moscow in the 1990s. Known as the Belov dossier, it claims that the debris recovered from the tunnels included a partially assembled device composed of concentric metal, rings and vacuum tubes connected to a large capacitor bank. Soviet engineers concluded it was a prototype of unknown function, possibly intended for field deployment as a directed energy device. Western analysts who have seen the dossier remain divided. Was it a genuine prototype or simply an experimental generator? Today, the tunnels beneath the Harz remain sealed. Many of them collapsed, others flooded. Occasional expeditions by amateur historians have yielded rusted machinery, human remains, and fragments of technical documents, but never anything conclusive. Local authorities discourage excavation, citing safety risks. Still, the legend of Projekt Morgenrot persists, a shadow hanging over the history of the war's final months. The truth may never be fully known. Whether Morgenrot represented a leap in weapons technology, an early foray into experimental physics, or nothing more than the fever dream of a collapsing Reich, it was important enough to be buried, literally and historically. What is certain is that the Allies, the Soviets, and perhaps even elements within Germany itself, conspired to ensure that its secrets would never see the light of day. All that remains are fragments, blurred photographs, half-burned blueprints, and whispers in the footnotes of forgotten intelligence files. And somewhere, deep beneath the Harz, sealed behind tons of rock and concrete, lies whatever the Reich did not want the world to find. On the night of May 6, 1945, with the Third Reich collapsing into ruin, a heavily guarded train pulled out of Dresden, bound for Prague. It carried no soldiers, no civilians, only 12 sealed freight cars. Within those cars, according to surviving fragments of Allied intercepts, were hundreds of crates of Reich archives, diplomatic correspondence, and coded ledgers. Some of the material, intelligence officers believed, contained records of Germany's secret financial transactions and covert understandings with supposedly neutral states. The convoy was given a code name known only to a handful of German officials, Operation Wolfsherz. The train was escorted by Waffen-SS troops drawn from the 6th Panzer Army, and its passage was shielded by Luftwaffe night fighters. Yet, somewhere along the line between Dresden and Prague, the train disappeared. Soviet patrols advancing through Bohemia reported finding scorched rails, wreckage from strafing aircraft, and the corpses of guards. But not a single freight car was recovered intact. The official Soviet report filed to Marshal Konev stated simply, "The special convoy has been destroyed by unknown means." Western intelligence sources were never satisfied with that answer. 2 weeks later, a decrypted British Ultra intercept surfaced. It contained a message sent from Prague on May 7th, the day before Germany's unconditional surrender. The cable read, "Wolfsherz cargo secured, transport concealed, await instructions from London." The message bore an Allied encryption prefix, suggesting it had been sent by an operative working under British command. If genuine, it would mean at least part of the train's contents had not been destroyed by Soviet artillery or German demolition squads, but had been intercepted and hidden by Allied intelligence itself. No official trace of Operation Wolfsherz appears in German war diaries, yet evidence of its existence has leaked from unexpected places. In 1975, a retired Czech railway inspector named Antonín Vlček gave a sworn testimony to a Prague journalist, claiming he had witnessed the train's final passage. He described how it entered a series of tunnels near Český Šternberk and never emerged. Days later, he was ordered by Soviet officers to oversee the demolition of the tunnel entrances. Vlček swore he saw men in British uniforms near the site before it was sealed. His account was dismissed as unreliable, but it echoed rumours that British Special Operations Executive (SOE) teams had moved quickly to secure Nazi archives before the Red Army could seize them. What might have been in those crates? Historians, who have examined fragmentary evidence, point to diplomatic correspondence between Berlin and certain neutral governments, including Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland. These files may have contained evidence of German gold transfers, secret industrial contracts, and covert negotiations for a separate peace with the Western Allies. There are also persistent claims that Wolfsherz carried sensitive documents proving collaboration by figures within Allied governments, an explosive revelation if true. The fact that such files have never surfaced in any post-war tribunal lends weight to the suspicion that they were quietly removed from circulation. In 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a former KGB archivist named Sergei Melnikov gave an interview in Munich. He claimed the KGB had possessed fragments of the Wolfsherz archives, but that most of the train's cargo had vanished into British hands before the Soviets reached the tunnels. According to Melnikov, the Soviets retrieved only scattered crates containing lists of German industrialists and coded ledgers of gold transfers through Swiss banks. The rest, he insisted, was already gone. "The West took what could embarrass them," he said, "and left us what could be used against their corporations." American intelligence reports from the early Cold War add another layer of suspicion. In 1948, a memorandum from the US State Department refers obliquely to sensitive documents of German provenance, origin Dresden, secured by Allied service, to remain classified indefinitely. No further explanation is given, but the reference matches precisely the timeline of Wolfsherz. The files remain sealed under national security exemptions to this day. Legends of the lost train have fueled treasure hunters for decades, but it is unlikely that Wolfsherz carried only gold or valuables. The Reich was collapsing, and financial wealth could be laundered through neutral banks without the risk of transport. What mattered most in those final days were the documents, proof of alliances, betrayals, and deals struck in secret. To the Allies, possession of such evidence meant not only leverage over defeated Germany, but potential influence over neutral states whose wartime conduct had been less than honorable. One overlooked document adds chilling weight to the case. In 1952, a US Army historian compiling records of Germany's surrender encountered a reference in a SHAF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force log. It mentioned dossiers from train transport Dresden-Prague now secured at undisclosed British facility. When he asked for clarification, his inquiry was shut down. The log entry itself was later removed from the file, surviving only in his private notes. Today, the tunnels near Český Šternberk remain collapsed, their entrances dynamited shut. Occasional attempts at excavation by local explorers have uncovered rusted tracks, scorched timbers, and fragments of German documents. None, however, have provided definitive proof of what Wolfsherz carried, or who took it. The Czech government maintains silence while British archives refuse to confirm or deny possession of relevant files. The disappearance of the Wolfsherz train is not simply the story of a vanished convoy, it is the story of erased history. Somewhere in sealed vaults, perhaps in London, perhaps in Moscow, lie the files that could explain the true nature of Germany's final days, and the secret bargains made as the world prepared for a Cold War. Until they are revealed, the train remains both a ghost and a weapon, a reminder that history is written not only by the victors, but also by those who decide which records survive. In the summer of 1951, during the height of the Korean War, US occupation forces in Tokyo quietly transferred a cache of sealed crates from a warehouse in Shinagawa to an American military transport ship. The crates bore the chrysanthemum seal of the Japanese Imperial Army. Inside were thousands of pages of reports, medical charts, autopsy sketches, and photographic evidence detailing a program so horrific that even the Nazis had expressed disgust when rumors reached Berlin. These were the surviving files of Unit 731, Japan's secret biological warfare unit, recovered from Manchuria after the war. Officially, they were to be used as evidence in post-war tribunals. Unofficially, they disappeared into US Army intelligence archives under the codename Operation Harvest. Unit 731, commanded by General Shiro Ishii, had operated out of Pingfang near Harbin from 1936 until the Soviet invasion of Manchuria in August 1945. Prisoners of war and civilians alike were subjected to live vivisections, frostbite, experiments, and deliberate infection with plague, anthrax, and cholera. By conservative estimates, tens of thousands perished. When Japan surrendered, the expectation was that its officers would be tried alongside their German counterparts at Nuremberg. Yet, in Tokyo, something very different occurred. In September 1945, US General Douglas MacArthur received a memorandum from his intelligence staff suggesting the Unit 731 files contained data of inestimable value for future warfare. A series of secret meetings followed between American G2 officers and surviving Japanese scientists. By early 1946, Ishii himself was negotiating immunity in exchange for cooperation. The deal was never put on the public record. When the International Military Tribunal for the Far East convened in May 1946, Unit 731's activities were mentioned only in passing, and no charges were filed against its members. The reason, declassified fragments later revealed, was harvest. The United States quietly absorbed the entirety of the biological warfare research, suppressing it from both the Japanese public and international prosecutors. A captured memorandum from February 1947, signed by Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders of the US Army states, data acquired through harvest to be classified top secret. Immunity granted to Ishii and associates under authority of SCAP, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers. Material to be integrated into US BW program at Fort Detrick. Fort Detrick in Maryland was at that time the epicenter of America's biological warfare research. Survivors in China and Korea protested. In 1949, the Soviet Union conducted its own trial in Khabarovsk, convicting 12 Japanese officers for crimes against humanity related to Unit 731. The trial produced detailed testimony about human experimentation, but Western media dismissed it as propaganda. American diplomats claimed the Soviets had fabricated evidence. What was not known publicly was that the United States already had the original files and had every reason to discredit the Soviet account. The secrecy surrounding Operation Harvest grew darker when the Korean War erupted in June 1950. Reports from Chinese and North Korean forces accused the United States of deploying biological weapons. The charges were officially denied, yet captured US Air Force pilots gave confessions under unclear circumstances that referenced strange devices dropped from aircraft. To this day, historians argue over whether those confessions were coerced or whether they pointed to a hidden truth. What is certain is that the knowledge extracted from Unit 731 played a role in shaping US biological warfare doctrine during the conflict. By the mid-1950s, references to Harvest had all but vanished from official files. Yet in 1982, a former Fort Detrick microbiologist named Sheldon Harris testified that experiments conducted in Maryland during the early Cold War bore unmistakable resemblance to the Unit 731 protocols. He claimed test animals were infected under conditions directly copied from Japanese data, and that charts in the lab bore handwritten notations in Japanese alongside English translations. Harris's testimony was never followed up by Congress, but it confirmed suspicions long whispered in academic circles. Additional fragments surfaced in 1995, when a Japanese journalist obtained copies of declassified US Army correspondence. One memo, dated March 1951, the same year the crates left Shinagawa, explicitly ordered that all Unit 731 data and specimens are to be secured under harvest classification, dissemination restricted to Army Chemical Corps and select Detrick personnel. Another note warned that public disclosure would gravely damage US strategic interests and risk international condemnation. The Japanese public began uncovering the truth on its own. In the 1980s, former Unit 731 personnel began giving interviews, some out of guilt, others for notoriety. They described dissecting prisoners alive without anesthesia, infecting children with plague, and strapping captives to wooden stakes before unleashing weaponized fleas. Survivors' families demanded answers from both Tokyo and Washington. Both governments maintained silence. To this day, neither Japan nor the United States has issued a formal acknowledgement of the immunity deal. One of the most disturbing aspects of Operation Harvest is the suggestion that the files did not merely sit in archives but were actively used. A 2002 investigation by Japanese researchers uncovered evidence that Ishii himself lived comfortably in Tokyo until his death in 1959, working quietly as a consultant for US intelligence. His daughter later claimed he traveled to Maryland in 1951 to lecture American scientists. Though unverified, the claim aligns with US Army transport records showing a Dr. Ishii arriving in Baltimore that year. If the files were as valuable as claimed, what exactly did they contain? Surviving fragments reference field trials 103-121, conducted in Manchuria between 1941 and 1944, involving weaponized plague fleas released in populated areas. Another document describes Frostbite Series C, where prisoners were exposed to sub-zero temperatures until limbs blackened, then treated with various chemical compounds. Still others detail the effects of syphilis infection, starvation, and high-pressure chambers. The level of detail was far beyond anything Western science had attempted, and that was precisely why the US wanted it. Today, portions of the Unit 731 files have been declassified in Japan, but the bulk of Operation Harvest remains sealed. In US archives, requests under the Freedom of Information Act are routinely denied under national security exemptions. Historians who have managed to access redacted versions describe entire pages blacked out, names removed, and references to Fort Detrick excised. The true extent of the knowledge transferred remains hidden. The silence raises a haunting question. Did the United States, in the early years of the Cold War, build part of its biological warfare capacity on the corpses of Unit 731's victims? If so, the cost was not only human, but moral. By trading justice for data, the Allies ensured that some of the worst crimes of the Second World War would never face a tribunal. The files of Operation Harvest remain locked away, the victims unnamed, their suffering reduced to statistics in classified ledgers. And yet, somewhere in a vault in Maryland or Washington, the truth sits in boxes, sealed and waiting, a grim inheritance of a bargain never meant to be known. On the night of March 12, 1945, a squadron of Royal Navy motor torpedo boats slipped quietly into the icy fjords of western Norway. Their mission, according to later fragments of War Cabinet memoranda, was to intercept a German convoy believed to be transporting heavy water bound for Reich laboratories. Official histories of the Second World War record no such raid. But buried in restricted files at Kew, now partially released, is the codename Operation Blackwave. It was an operation so sensitive that within weeks, every mention of it was purged. From British records, the convoy they targeted was real. German records confirm that 3 cargo vessels left Bergen under Kriegsmarine escort, carrying crates marked Maschinen and Metallteil. For decades, it was assumed these shipments were linked to the German atomic program and its heavy water experiments. But when survivors of the British raiding party later spoke in guarded tones, their recollections pointed to something else entirely. One of those men, Sub-Lieutenant Richard Henshaw of the Special Boat Service, was debriefed in April 1945. His transcript, discovered in 2007 in a private family archive, describes how the commandos stormed one of the German freighters and opened its holds. Instead of barrels of heavy water, they found sealed crates of microfilm canisters, precision-engineered alloy components, and large copper coils. Several crates bore the eagle and swastika seal of Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring's office. "We didn't know what we were looking at," Henshaw told his interrogators. "It wasn't bomb material, and it wasn't industrial gear. The officers told us to load the lot and burn the rest." Official logs for the mission end abruptly on March 15th. The boats returned to Scapa Flow, their cargo removed under guard by MI6 officers. From there, the trail vanishes. In May 1945, War Cabinet records include a note reading, "Blackwave files to be removed from Admiralty Registry. Subject closed by directive." No such directive is explained. The few veterans who attempted to speak of it in later years were silenced by the Official Secrets Act. The Germans, however, had their own version of events. In the late 1960s, a researcher in Buenos Aires uncovered testimonies from U-boat crewmen who claimed that a sister convoy carrying identical cargo sailed weeks later from Kiel, reaching Argentina by mid-1945. According to their accounts, the cargo consisted of experimental power systems and documentation on an unnamed Reich project. The suggestion that both allies and remnants of the Reich sought to secure the same technology has fueled suspicion that Blackwave was not about denying Germany the atomic bomb, but about appropriating something far stranger: a fragmentary RAF. Intelligence note, declassified in 1993, refers obliquely to high-frequency test assemblies recovered in Norwegian operation, March 1945. The note warns of severe physiological effects observed during handling. A second memorandum, marked "For Admiralty Eyes Only," orders that surviving personnel exposed to the cargo be monitored for aberrant symptoms. This line, stripped of context, is the only surviving hint of what Blackwave's commandos might have stumbled upon. The Norwegian resistance also recorded whispers of the raid. In the archives of Milorg, the clandestine military organization, is a diary entry from March 14, 1945, describing explosions in the fjord near Sognefjord and a strange light in the sky, like a storm without thunder. Villagers reported hearing engines late at night and then silence. Inquiries to British authorities after the war were brushed aside with the explanation that no such action occurred. The mystery deepened in the 1980s when a classified NATO technical report was accidentally filed among open access materials. It referenced German alloyed copper segments of unknown function, provenance Norway 1945, currently in storage at Aldermaston. The file was swiftly withdrawn, but not before researchers copied portions of it. The implication was staggering. Fragments of the Blackwave cargo were still being held in Britain 4 decades later. Theories abound as to what the Germans were moving. Some suggest it was part of an advanced radar or communications array. Others argue it was tied to experiments in high-voltage plasma discharge systems. Whatever it was deemed dangerous enough for the British to erase the entire operation. From history, the absence of documentation itself is telling. The Admiralty's war diaries, normally meticulous, skip entirely over the week in March when Blackwave occurred. For the men who took part, silence was enforced. Sub-Lieutenant Henshaw died in 1971, leaving behind only his guarded transcript. Another commando, Sergeant David Rowe, confided to his son that the mission wasn't about heavy water at all, but refused to elaborate. When pressed, he simply said, "We brought something back that wasn't meant to exist." If true, Operation Blackwave represents a chapter of the war that never made it into the official narrative, a mission where the Allies may have seized experimental German technology, then concealed it not from their enemies, but from their own citizens. The raid's erasure from British records suggests that whatever was taken, it was never meant to enter the historical record of the Second World War. The fjords of Norway keep their secrets. To this day, divers occasionally report sunken wrecks. In the region, their holds still sealed. Local legends speak of a ghost ship that vanished into the fjord mist during the last months of the war. What is certain is that men died, files were destroyed, and cargo vanished without trace. In the cold waters of Sognefjord, beneath layers of silt and secrecy, lies the shadow of Operation Blackwave, a mission that officially never happened, but whose consequences may still shape the hidden architecture of post-war power. In May 1945, as the Red Army tore through the ruins of Berlin, Smersh counterintelligence units combed the wreckage of the Reich Chancellery in search of Adolf Hitler's personal archives. Beneath the shattered concrete, in a half-flooded vault, they uncovered something unexpected. Hundreds of dossiers stamped Geheime Reichssache, secret Reich matter. According to a Soviet field report now partially declassified, the files contained lists of Allied double agents who had been secretly working with or for the Reich. Within days, the material was shipped directly to Moscow, sealed under Lubyanka custody, and classified at the highest level. The Chancellery archives were believed to have been destroyed by fire. Yet the Soviet discovery indicated otherwise. The files included names, code names, and operational histories of agents who had infiltrated Allied command structures, relaying intelligence back to Berlin. One chilling fragment, preserved in the Soviet General Staff archives, refers to OSS officers under Reich influence, reporting via Stockholm and Lisbon. Another lists supposed French resistance leaders identified as assets of Amt 6, the foreign intelligence arm of the RSHA under Walter Schellenberg. The suggestion that Germany had penetrated the Allied intelligence apparatus at such a level was explosive, and it explains why, to this day, almost no trace of the so-called Chancellery lists exists in Western archives. What happened next has fueled decades of speculation. Between 1947 and 1952, a wave of unexplained deaths and disappearances swept through former Allied intelligence circles. At least 7 OSS officers who had worked in neutral European stations during the war died under mysterious circumstances, officially ruled suicides or accidents. In Paris, former resistance liaison Paul Delacroix fell from a 6th-story window in 1948. In Washington, Captain Harold Ashcroft of the OSS allegedly shot himself in 1949, though no suicide note was ever found. In London, 2 MI6 veterans vanished without trace in 1951. None of these cases were ever linked by investigators at the time, but private memos circulated within NATO intelligence hint at a Soviet purge based on the Chancellery files, declassified. Fragments from British archives offer tantalizing corroboration. A 1953 MI5 memorandum, labeled Top Secret, Eyes Only, notes, "We cannot discount the possibility that Moscow is in possession of compromising lists obtained in Berlin. Several of our wartime contacts have since been neutralized in circumstances, suggesting targeted action." The memo was marked for destruction, but survived in a misfiled folder at Kew, uncovered in the 1990s by researchers. The Americans were no less concerned. In 1964, a Senate subcommittee investigating wartime intelligence stumbled upon testimony from a retired Army counterintelligence officer, Colonel Robert Mallory. Under questioning, Mallory admitted that certain sensitive files believed to be in Soviet hands contained the names of Allied personnel compromised by Nazi intelligence. When pressed, he refused to elaborate, citing security restrictions. His testimony was struck from the record, and the hearing proceeded without mention of it again. For the Soviets, possession of such lists would have been invaluable. Not only could they identify compromised Allied networks, But they could also blackmail or recruit individuals whose wartime loyalties were questionable. Some historians now argue that the Kremlin's surprising success in infiltrating Western governments during the early Cold War was not solely the result of ideological penetration, but also of material leverage derived from captured German intelligence. If true, the Chancellery files may have provided Moscow with a roadmap to Western vulnerabilities for decades. One particularly disturbing possibility is that the Allies themselves knew about the lists but chose to suppress their existence. In 1957, a CIA internal assessment acknowledged the potential exposure of high-level wartime duplicity if the Soviet-held files were ever made public. Another note from the same year advised that official denial remains the only viable course. This suggests that Washington feared the political fallout more than the operational risk. Eyewitness testimony provides further hints. In 1992, a retired Soviet archivist named Anatoly Karpov claimed he had personally handled some of the Chancellery dossiers at the Lubyanka. He recalled seeing the names of Western officials of considerable importance, annotated with notes about meetings in Lisbon and Stockholm. Karpov described how the files were considered so sensitive that even senior KGB officers required clearance to view them. When asked whether the names included prominent American or British figures, he simply replied, "If they had been revealed, the post-war alliance would not have survived." Despite repeated calls from researchers, the Russian government has never released the Chancellery files. Western governments remain silent as well. Occasional leaks hint at the scale of the operation, but none provide definitive proof. In 2010, a German historian published what he claimed was a partial transcription of a single file listing OSS codenames, though its authenticity could not be verified. Even if genuine, it raised more questions than answers. The absence of proof has allowed official histories of the war to proceed without acknowledging the possibility that Allied intelligence was penetrated at its highest levels. Yet the pattern of post-war disappearances, the suppressed memos, and the testimony of those who glimpsed the files all point to a disturbing conclusion. The victors of the war may have carried forward a hidden legacy of betrayal, one that could never be admitted publicly. Today, beneath the granite walls of the former Lubyanka, the files almost certainly still exist. Whether locked away in Moscow, scattered in Western vaults, or destroyed to prevent disclosure, their shadow lingers over the history of the Second World War and the Cold War that followed. They represent not only the buried secrets of Berlin, but also the moral compromises of nations unwilling to face the extent of their own infiltration. The Reich fell in 1945, its chancellery burned, its leaders executed or dead. But the files survived, and in those files, written in German ink and preserved in Soviet vaults, lies the untold story of the men who fought not for nations, but for themselves, and who were erased before their betrayal could ever be made known. History tells us the war ended with parades and surrender papers, but beneath the official record lies another battlefield, one fought in silence, through files that vanished, lives erased, and truths deliberately smothered. The dead remain, unburied, their voices trapped in classified pages, while their legacy festers in the shadows. The deeper you look, the more you realize. The war was never truly over. It was only hidden from view, waiting for someone reckless enough to drag it into the light.